Hey everyone, today we're diving into one of history's darkest corners, execution. Not just any executions, methods so brutal, so symbolic, they reveal how societies weaponize pain, fear, and even spectacle to enforce power. From Viking rituals to colonial terror, these are 10 execution styles you've probably never heard of, and why they'll haunt you long after this video ends. So, brace yourselves, this is going to be intense. Let's get into it. Alright, kicking things off with something truly horrific. We have scaphism, also known as the boats. This method comes to us from the ancient Persian Empire, and trust me, it's the stuff of nightmares. It wasn't just about killing someone, it was about making an example, about a slow, agonizing, and deeply humiliating demise, usually reserved for traitors or enemies of the state. Imagine being an object of public revulsion, your suffering drawn out for days, even weeks, under the relentless sun. The psychological torment alone is hard to fathom, knowing what awaited you and being utterly powerless to stop it. This was a calculated descent into hell, designed to break not just the body, but the spirit. So, how did it work? The unfortunate victim would be placed inside a narrow boat, or sometimes between two boats, one placed over the other like a grotesque human sandwich. Their head, hands, and feet would be left protruding, exposed to the elements. But that was just the beginning of the horror. They would then be force-fed large quantities of milk and honey. Now, you might think, milk and honey? That doesn't sound so bad. But the intention here was diabolical. The mixture would induce severe diarrhea, and the victim would be left to lie in their own accumulating filth within the confines of the boat. It's a truly disgusting image, designed to strip away every last shred of dignity. But the milk and honey served another even more sinister purpose. The sticky sweetness combined with the accumulating excrement would attract insects, all kinds of insects. Flies would come first, laying eggs, and soon maggots would begin to feast on the helpless victim. Wasps, bees, and other biting and stinging creatures would be drawn to the scene, adding their own particular brand of torment. The victim would be covered in honey externally as well, to make them an even more irresistible target. They were, quite literally, being eaten alive bit by an army of tiny torturers, all while trapped and exposed. The suffering was unimaginable. Dehydration, starvation, septic shock from infected wounds, and gangrene were all part of this horrifying process. The executioners might even reapply the honey and continue the force-feeding daily to prolong the agony. Plutarch, the ancient Greek historian, described an instance where a soldier subjected to scaphism supposedly survived for 17 days. 17 days of being consumed by insects, rotting in your own waste under a baking sun. It's a level of cruelty that's hard to comprehend, a deliberate effort to make death as slow and as painful as humanly possible. Ultimately, scaphism was a potent tool of terror. It wasn't just about punishment, it was about sending a clear, unambiguous message to anyone who dared to cross the authorities. The public nature of the suffering, the slow decay, the utter helplessness of the victim, it was all designed to instill fear and obedience. The symbolism was stark. Betray the state, and you will suffer a fate worse than a quick death. You will become a living feast for vermin, a decaying monument to your transgressions. It's a chilling reminder of how far some societies would go to maintain their grip on power. Next up, we travel to ancient Rome, a civilization known for its engineering marvels and legal systems, but also for some truly inventive forms of punishment. One of the most bizarre and symbolic was poena cullae, which translates to penalty of the sack. This wasn't a punishment for just any crime. It was specifically reserved for parricide, the act of killing one's own parents or other close ascendants. To the Romans, parricide was an abhorrent crime, a profound violation of pietas and the natural order, and so the punishment had to be equally extraordinary and symbolic, reflecting the gravity of the offense. The ritual itself was a complex and horrifying affair. According to historical accounts, the condemned person would first be scourged or whipped, with vergus sanguinis rods literally described as blood-colored, implying a severe beating. After this initial torment, the truly unique part of the punishment began. The parricide was then sewn into a large leather sack known as a cullius, but they wouldn't be alone in there. It's said that a number of live animals were also sealed into the sack with the condemned, typically a dog, a rooster, a viper, and sometimes an ape. Each animal likely held symbolic significance, though interpretations vary among historians. Imagine the sheer terror of being trapped in a dark, confined space with these creatures. The viper, obviously venomous and dangerous, the dog and rooster perhaps representing desecrated household guardians or a perversion of loyalty, the ape, a grotesque caricature of a human being possibly symbolizing the inhumanity of the crime. As the sack was jostled and prepared for its final destination, these animals, terrified and agitated, would undoubtedly bite, scratch, and attack the condemned person, adding another layer of physical and psychological torture before death even arrived. It's a chaotic, nightmarish scene to even contemplate. Once the sack was securely sewn shut, with the condemned and the menagerie of animals trapped inside, it was then transported and thrown into a body of water, either the sea or a nearby river. This final act was also deeply symbolic. By casting the sack into the water, the Romans ensured that the parricide was denied a proper burial on land, effectively contaminating neither the earth with their remains nor the sky with their funeral pyre. It was an ultimate form of ostracization, a denial of peace even in death, and a way to symbolically cleanse the community of the pollution caused by such a heinous act. Powena Cooley, therefore, was far more than just an execution. It was a powerful ritual designed to express societal outrage and restore a perceived cosmic balance disrupted by the crime of parricide. The bizarre cruelty, the inclusion of animals, the denial of burial, it all served to emphasize the unnatural and monstrous nature of the offense. It highlights how Roman society, despite its advanced legal codes, could also embrace forms of punishment that were deeply rooted in ancient, almost primal ideas about pollution, purity, and the sacredness of familial bonds. It stands as a testament to how societies can use ritualistic violence to reinforce their most deeply held values. Now we journey to Imperial China for a method of execution so infamous it's known in the West as death by 1,000 cuts, Ling Chi. This brutal form of capital punishment was used for exceptionally heinous crimes such as treason or the murder of one's parents from roughly the 10th century until its official abolition in 1905. Ling Chi wasn't just about ending a life, it was a prolonged public spectacle designed to maximize suffering and humiliation, serving as a terrifying deterrent. The very name, Ling Chi, can be translated as slow slicing or the lingering death, which gives you a pretty clear idea of what it entailed. The execution was carried out in a public place, often a marketplace, to ensure the largest possible audience. The condemned would be tied to a wooden frame and the executioner, armed with a sharp knife, would methodically remove portions of their flesh. The process was deliberately slow. The goal wasn't to kill the victim quickly, but to keep them alive for as long as possible while inflicting an excruciating series of wounds. Cuts were made to the arms, legs, and chest, with the executioner skillfully avoiding major arteries to prolong the ordeal. Sometimes opium was administered, not as an act of mercy, but supposedly to keep the victim conscious and aware of their torment for longer. The number of cuts was often symbolic, though the 1,000 cuts figure was likely an exaggeration in most cases. However, historical accounts do describe executions involving hundreds of incisions over hours, sometimes even days. The crowd would watch this gruesome spectacle unfold, and it was meant to be a visceral lesson in the consequences of defying the state or committing unforgivable acts. It was a form of state-sanctioned terror where the body of the condemned became a public canvas for the ultimate expression of imperial power and wrath. The psychological impact on both the victim and the onlookers must have been profound. Interestingly, Ling Chi existed within a cultural context that placed great importance on bodily integrity, partly influenced by Confucian values, which emphasized filial piety even towards one's own body received from parents. To be dismembered in such a way was not only agonizingly painful, but also a profound disgrace affecting not just the individual, but their entire family. It was a punishment that extended beyond death, bringing shame and dishonor. This blend of extreme physical cruelty with deep cultural and social humiliation made Ling Chi an incredibly potent tool of control. The state wasn't just taking a life, it was systematically destroying a person in every conceivable way. The practice of Ling Chi eventually drew condemnation from Western observers in the 19th century as China had more contact with the outside world. Photographs of Ling Chi executions circulated, causing international outrage and contributing to pressure on the Qing dynasty to modernize its legal system. Finally, in 1905, Ling Chi was officially abolished, marking the end of one of history's most notorious and visually horrifying methods of execution. Its legacy, however, endures as a chilling example of how far states can go in the name of justice and deterrence, blurring the lines between punishment and pure, unadulterated cruelty. From Imperial China, we sail to the icy lands of the Norse to explore a method of execution so gruesome it has become legendary, the blood eagle. This supposed Viking ritual is described in several Norse sagas and poetic texts, often as a form of ultimate revenge exacted upon particularly hated enemies, or as a sacrifice to the god Odin. The descriptions are visceral and terrifying, painting a picture of almost unimaginable suffering. If it was indeed practiced as described, it would undoubtedly rank among the most brutal execution methods ever conceived by humankind. According to the saga accounts, the blood eagle involved an incredibly complex and agonizing procedure. The victim would typically be laid face down. The executioner would then carve the shape of an eagle's wings onto their back with a sharp blade. After this initial carving, the ribs were said to be severed from the spine, one by one, and then forcibly bent outwards, creating a pair of bloody rib-bone wings. The final, horrifying step, as described in some sources, was to pull the victim's lungs out through the openings in their back and lay them over the wings, supposedly resembling the folded wings of an eagle. The victim would, of course, die from this horrific mutilation, likely from suffocation or massive blood loss. Now, here's where it gets interesting. There's a significant debate among historians about whether the blood eagle was a real historical practice or a literary motif, a gruesome embellishment created by saga writers to emphasize the brutality of certain characters or events, or perhaps a misunderstanding of older poetic kennings. Some scholars argue that the anatomical practicalities of performing such an act, especially keeping the victim alive long enough for the wings and lungs to be displayed, make it highly improbable. They suggest it might have been a more symbolic act, or simply a terrifying story. However, other historians and archaeologists believe that it could have been a real, albeit rare, ritualistic execution. They point to the consistency of descriptions across different sagas and the Viking penchant for brutal displays of power and vengeance. If it was real, the symbolic meaning would have been profound. It could have been seen as a sacrifice to Odin, the All-Father, who was associated with eagles and with death in battle. It would also serve as the ultimate humiliation and warning to enemies, a demonstration of merciless retribution that would echo through the generations. The very act of transforming a human back into the likeness of a predatory bird is laden with dark symbolism. Regardless of whether the blood eagle was a consistently practiced ritual or a terrifying legend amplified by storytellers, its place in popular imagination is undeniable. It encapsulates the fearsome reputation of the Vikings, their ferocity, their capacity for cruelty, and their complex, often brutal, belief system. The sheer imagery of the blood eagle, the methodical deconstruction of a human body into a grotesque parody of an animal, is enough to send shivers down anyone's spine. It remains a potent symbol of Viking brutality, a dark legend from the north that continues to fascinate and horrify us centuries later. Our next method takes us to the era of colonial expansion, specifically to British India in the 19th century. This execution style, known as blowing from a cannon, was a particularly brutal and psychologically devastating form of capital punishment employed by the British East India Company, and later the British Crown, primarily against Indian sepoys or soldiers who mutinied or rebelled. While cannon fire had been used in warfare for centuries, its adaptation as a formal method of execution was designed not just to kill, but to utterly terrorize and demoralize the local population. The mechanics of this execution were straightforward, but incredibly gruesome. The condemned person was typically positioned directly in front of the muzzle of a cannon, with their back or sometimes their chest pressed against it. Their arms might be tied to the wheels of the cannon, or their body simply lashed securely to the barrel itself. When the cannon was fired, often using a blank cartridge as the concussive force and any wadding were more than enough, the effect on the human body was catastrophic. The victim was instantaneously blasted apart, their body disintegrated into a shower of gore and bone fragments. The sheer spectacle of this was a key part of its intended effect. These executions were almost always public, carried out before assembled troops and often civilian onlookers. The roar of the cannon, the sudden obliteration of a human being, the scattering of remains over a wide area, it was a horrifying display of overwhelming power. Witnesses described scenes of body parts being flung hundreds of feet, with heads, limbs, and torsos landing far from the site of the cannon. It was a visceral and unforgettable demonstration of the consequences of defying British rule. Beyond the immediate physical horror, Blowing from a cannon had a profound psychological and cultural impact, particularly in the Indian context. For many Hindus and Muslims, proper burial or cremation rites are essential for the soul's passage in the afterlife. An execution that literally scattered the body to the winds, making recovery of remains for funeral rites impossible, was seen as a terrible desecration, a punishment that extended beyond death into the spiritual realm. This violation of deeply held religious beliefs was a deliberate tactic to maximize the terror and humiliation inflicted upon the condemned and their communities. This method was most notoriously used during and after the Indian Mutiny of 1857, also known as the First War of Indian Independence. The British employed it to make terrifying examples of mutineers, hoping to crush the rebellion and deter future dissent. It was a clear message. Resistance would be met not just with death, but with a death designed to be as shocking, as degrading, and as spiritually damaging as possible. Blowing from a cannon stands as a stark example of colonial power weaponizing execution, not just for punishment, but as a brutal instrument of psychological warfare and cultural subjugation. Now let's venture into a realm where folklore, fear, and pharmacology intertwine the concept of zombie poison from Haitian Vodou culture. This isn't an execution method in the traditional sense, but rather a form of social and spiritual death, a terrifying fate that could be inflicted by powerful sorcerers or bokors. The idea of becoming a zombie, a soulless body reanimated to serve a master, is a potent horror that has captivated people for generations, and its roots are deeply embedded in the traumatic history of slavery in Haiti. The traditional belief is that a bokor can administer a specific powder or potion, the zombie poison, to a victim. This substance doesn't kill them outright, but induces a state of apparent death where vital signs become almost undetectable. The victim is then mistakenly pronounced dead and buried. Later, the bokor returns to the grave, exhumes the corpse, and through rituals, reanimates the body. However, the soul, or tibonange, is said to be captured or displaced, leaving behind a mindless, will-less shell, the zombie now enslaved to the bokor's will. There has been considerable scientific interest in zombification, most famously by ethnobotanist Wade Davis in the 1980s. Davis proposed that the zombie poison might contain potent neurotoxins, particularly tetrodotoxin from pufferfish, which can induce paralysis and a death-like state. He also suggested that psychoactive plants like datura could be used to maintain delirium and suggestibility. While Davis's theories are debated and not universally accepted, they offered a potential pharmacological explanation. However, the true horror lies in its powerful symbolism, especially in a society forged from the crucible of slavery. For enslaved Africans in Haiti, the zombie represented the ultimate loss of freedom, a state even worse than death, where one's body continued to toil without consciousness, will, or hope. It was a terrifying metaphor for the dehumanizing experience of slavery itself, where individuals were stripped of their identity, their agency, and their connection to their ancestors and spirit. The fear of zombification reflected terror of perpetual enslavement extending even beyond the grave. So while not a state-sanctioned execution, the threat of zombification functioned as powerful social control and a reflection of profound existential fears within Haitian culture. It speaks to the horrors of losing one's soul, oneself, and becoming a puppet in the hands of another. The legend of the zombie and its poison is a chilling reminder of how cultural beliefs can encapsulate the deepest traumas, turning abstract fears into terrifying narratives of living death and spiritual annihilation. Let's turn our attention back to Europe, specifically the medieval and early modern periods, to examine a device that served a horrifying dual purpose as both an instrument of torture and a method of execution: the iron chair. Sometimes called the Judas chair, or Chinese torture chair. Though, honestly, its widespread use was European, this contraption was ingeniously designed to inflict maximum agony, often over a prolonged period. Its very appearance was intimidating, a stark metal throne promising not comfort, but unspeakable suffering. The construction of these chairs varied, but they typically shared common, terrifying features. They were made entirely of iron and were often studded with hundreds of sharp spikes. On the seat, the backrest, the armrests, and sometimes even the leg rests, the victim would be forcibly seated on this bed of nails, and restraints would be used to secure them tightly in place, pressing their flesh deeper onto the piercing points. The sheer number of spikes meant that while individually they might not be immediately fatal, collectively they would cause widespread, agonizing pain and bleeding. As a torture device, the iron chair was brutally effective. The pressure of the spikes could be gradually increased by tightening the restraints, or by the interrogators themselves forcing the victim down. This allowed for a slow escalation of pain, designed to break the will of the accused and extract confessions. The constant piercing, the inability to shift position, and the psychological torment of being impaled from multiple angles would have been unbearable. It was a systematic way to wear down a person's resistance through relentless, escalating agony. When the iron chair was used for execution, however, its horror was amplified. Beneath the metal seat of the chair, a space was often provided to build a fire, or to place hot coals or other heating elements. The iron of the chair would then slowly heat up, effectively roasting the victim alive from below while they were simultaneously being pierced by the spikes. The combination of being burned and impaled at the same time is almost too gruesome to contemplate. Death would be slow and excruciating, coming from a combination of burns, blood loss, shock, and the sheer trauma inflicted by the countless wounds. The iron chair stands as a chilling example of the meticulous cruelty that characterized historical methods of punishment. It wasn't designed for a quick end, but for a drawn-out ordeal that attacked the body from multiple fronts. The cold, unyielding iron, the sharp, unforgiving spikes, and the searing heat of the flames all combined to create an instrument of almost perfect torment. It's a grim reminder of a time when pain was not just a byproduct of punishment, but often its primary, meticulously engineered goal, turning justice into a theater of extreme suffering. Our next method is honestly one of the oldest and most viscerally horrifying forms of execution and torture: flaying. This is the act of removing the skin from a body, and when used as a method of execution, it was almost invariably performed while the victim was still alive. The sheer, unimaginable pain involved in this process makes it one of the most brutal punishments ever devised by human beings. It has been practiced in various cultures across the globe, from ancient Assyria to medieval Europe, and even in ritualistic contexts in the Americas. The process of flaying was as gruesome as it sounds. The victim would be restrained, often tied to a post or a frame. The executioner, using a series of sharp knives or other cutting tools, would then begin to carefully cut and peel away the skin. Sometimes the flaying would start with the face or the limbs and then progress to the torso. The aim was often to remove the skin in as large a piece as possible, a macabre trophy of the execution. The victim would be fully conscious for much, if not all, of this agonizing procedure, experiencing pain that is, well, beyond our capacity to truly comprehend. Death from flaying was rarely instantaneous. It would usually result from a combination of factors: massive blood loss, shock from the extreme pain, hypothermia due to the loss of skin which helps regulate body temperature, and eventually infection, if the victim somehow managed to survive the initial ordeal. The exposed muscle tissue and nerves would be incredibly sensitive to any touch, or even to the air itself, prolonging the agony until the very end. It was a slow, torturous death, designed to inflict the maximum possible suffering. Historically, flaying was used for a variety of reasons. In ancient Assyria, it was a common punishment for rebellious leaders or defeated enemies, and their flayed skins were often displayed on city walls as a terrifying warning to others. In medieval Europe, it was sometimes used for particularly heinous crimes, again with the intention of public deterrence. The visual horror of a flayed body, or even just the skin itself put on display, was a powerful tool for instilling fear and obedience. It was a statement that the authorities would stop at nothing to punish transgressors. Beyond its use as a punitive measure, flaying also appeared in ritualistic contexts. For example, in Aztec culture, the god Xipe-Totec, our lord the flayed one, was associated with agriculture, renewal, and goldsmiths. Rituals in his honor involved the flaying of sacrificial victims, and priests would then wear the flayed skins for a period, symbolizing the casting off of the old and the emergence of new life, like a seed shedding its husk. While the cultural context was different, the act itself remained incredibly brutal. Flaying in any context represents an extreme violation of the human body, a descent into profound agony and terror. Let's head out to sea for our next brutal punishment, a method synonymous with the harsh discipline of old maritime life: keel hauling. This particularly nasty form of corporal punishment, and often de facto execution, was practiced in various navies, most notably the Dutch and English from at least the 16th century, up until the early 19th century. It was reserved for serious offenses on board a ship, such as mutiny, repeated desertion, or striking an officer. The very name conjures images of a terrifying ordeal beneath the waves. So what exactly did keel hauling entail? The unfortunate sailor was tied to a rope that was looped beneath the ship, passing from one side. Under the keel, the central structural spine running along the bottom of the vessel and up the other side. Weights were often attached to the victim's legs to help pull them down and ensure they went fully under the ship. The sailor was then hauled, either quickly or sometimes slowly, down one side of the ship under the hull and up the other. This might be done once or multiple times depending on the severity of the crime or the cruelty of the captain. The suffering involved was immense and multifaceted. Firstly, there was the near certainty of drowning or at least inhaling significant amounts of seawater as the victim was dragged underwater. Secondly, the underside of a wooden ship's hull was rarely smooth. It was typically covered in sharp barnacles, splinters, and other marine growth. As the sailor was dragged across this rough surface, their skin would be ripped and lacerated, leading to severe injuries and blood loss. If their head struck the keel or the hull, they could suffer concussions or other serious head trauma. The outcome of keel hauling was highly unpredictable, which perhaps added to its terror. If the ship was large and the process was done slowly, the chances of drowning were very high. If it was done quickly on a smaller vessel, the victim might survive, but they would almost certainly be horrifically injured, often maimed for life. Death could come from drowning, from the physical trauma of being scraped against the hull, from subsequent infections of the wounds, or from a combination of these factors. It was a brutal gamble, with a man's life administered in the harshest of environments. Keel hauling served as a potent deterrent in the confined and often volatile world of a sailing ship. Discipline was paramount, and punishments needed to be severe to maintain order among a crew living in close quarters for months or even years on end. The public nature of the punishment, witnessed by the entire crew, would have sent a clear message about the consequences of insubordination. It's a grim testament to the brutal realities of life at sea in centuries past, where justice could be swift, merciless, and incredibly inventive in its cruelty. For our final method, we come to something that was, ironically, conceived with the intention of being more humane, but often resulted in gruesome failures: the upright jerker. This was a type of gallows mechanism used in some parts of the United States in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The standard drop gallows aimed to cause death by snapping the neck, but its success depended on a precise calculation of the victim's weight and the length of the drop. The upright jerker was an attempt to make this process more reliable and, theoretically, quicker. The theory behind the upright jerker was to use a system of weights and pulleys to rapidly jerk the condemned person upwards, rather than dropping them downwards. The noose would be placed around their neck, and then a heavy counterweight, when released, would yank the person sharply into the air. The idea was that this sudden, forceful upward motion would cause instantaneous dislocation of the cervical vertebrae and severance of the spinal cord, leading to a quick and painless death. It was an effort to apply mechanical principles to the grim business of execution, hoping for a more scientific and less messy outcome. Unfortunately, the reality of the upright jerker often fell horrifically short of its intended humane purpose. Instead of a clean break of the neck, the mechanism frequently malfunctioned or produced unpredictable results. In some cases, the upward jerk was not powerful enough, leading to slow and agonizing strangulation, the very thing traditional hangings sometimes caused, and which this device sought to avoid. The condemned would be left dangling, gasping for air, while the mechanism had failed to deliver its promised swift end. In other, even more gruesome instances, the force exerted by the upright jerker was too extreme. The most infamous example of this is the execution of Robert Goodale in Norwich, Connecticut in 1897. When the mechanism was triggered, Goodale was jerked upwards with such violence that he was nearly decapitated. His head was reportedly torn almost completely from his body, with only a few ligaments and tissues keeping it attached. The scene was so horrific that it caused widespread public revulsion and contributed to the decline in the use of this particular method. It was a clear and ghastly demonstration of the device's savage potential. The story of the upright jerker is a grim reminder of the often fraught attempts to sanitize or improve methods of execution. What was designed in theory to be a more efficient and less cruel way to end a life could, in practice, lead to outcomes that were arguably even more barbaric and visually disturbing than the methods it sought to replace. It highlights the inherent difficulties and ethical quandaries in the state's administration of death, and how the pursuit of a good execution can sometimes pave the way for uniquely horrifying failures. And there you have it. 10 execution methods from history that truly push the boundaries of what we can imagine in terms of cruelty and calculated suffering. From the insect-infested agony of scaphism to the gruesome misfires of the upright jerker, each of these practices tells a story, not just about the individuals who suffered them, but about the societies that devised and implemented them. They reveal how power was asserted, how fear was manufactured, and how deeply symbolic the act of taking a life could become. It's a stark look into the darker recesses of human history, and it's unsettling to say the least. These methods, for the most part, have been relegated to the blood-soaked pages of history books, and thank goodness for that. But the underlying questions they raise about justice, punishment, and the role of the state in inflicting pain are still incredibly relevant. We've moved away from such overt spectacles of brutality, but the debate over capital punishment itself and what constitutes a humane way to end a life continues around the world. It forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about our own capacity for cruelty and our ongoing quest for a justice that is both fair and, well, just. These methods aren't just about death, they're about power. How societies used pain to control, humiliate, or send a message. And while most are gone, the debate over ethical execution continues today. What do you think? Could any modern method ever be truly humane? Let me know below. If you're chilled but curious, hit like, subscribe, and ring that bell. Next week, real-life vampire legends that inspired Dracula. Stay morbid, folks. Thanks for sticking with me through this intense journey. I'll see you in the next one.